Core thesis: civilizations rarely end in firestorms, mushroom clouds, or sudden extinction events. They erode. Collapse is not an explosion, it is a long loss of coherence. Institutions hollow out, competence decays, trust thins, rituals lose meaning. The system keeps functioning, just badly enough that people adapt instead of revolt. By the time the public agrees something is wrong, the collapse is already old. 1. Collapse as withering, not apocalypse. The Hollywood myth versus reality. Most people imagine collapse as one decisive war, one financial crash, one revolution, one tyrant, one catastrophe. This framing is emotionally satisfying but historically false. Real collapse looks boring. It looks like paperwork errors. It looks like worse service. It looks like people lowering expectations. Instead of everything ends, what actually happens is, open quote, the system continues, but its outputs no longer justify its complexity. Close quote. That mismatch is the seed of withering. 2. Historical patterns of withering. Rome collapse took centuries. Rome did not fall in 476 AD. That date merely marks when no one bothered to stop the fall anymore. What actually happened? Currency debasement over generations. Professional bureaucracy replaced by patronage. Military loyalty shifting from state to individuals. Infrastructure unrepaired because no one remembered how. Law becoming symbolic rather than enforced. Romans in 300 AD still believed they lived in Rome. Romans in 450 AD still believed they lived in Rome. They were wrong, but only in hindsight. Rome didn't collapse, it thinned out. The Late Bronze Age collapse, c. 1200 BCE, often described as sudden, but that's misleading. What really happened? Trade networks became fragile and overspecialized. Elites depended on long supply chains. Bureaucracies grew rigid and ceremonial. Small shocks, drought, piracy, rebellion cascaded. Palaces burned, but the collapse started long before the fires. When the system finally snapped, it was already empty inside. The USSR, a modern example of withering. The Soviet Union collapsed without invasion or nuclear war. Signs of decay. Official narratives diverged from lived reality. Competence punished, loyalty rewarded. Informal systems replaced formal ones. No one believed the ideology, but everyone pretended. Collapse occurred the moment people stopped pretending. The state dissolved because no one felt responsible for maintaining it anymore. That's withering in its purest form. 3. The 3 core signs of withering. 1. Trust loss. Trust is civilizational oxygen. When trust erodes, laws become suggestions, credentials lose meaning, contracts require enforcement rather than honor, people retreat into family, tribe, or faction. The system still exists, but people no longer invest themselves in it. This is the first irreversible stage. 2. Competence erosion. In healthy civilizations, skilled people rise, systems reward mastery, failure teaches lessons. In withering civilizations, appearances matter more than outcomes. Risk is punished, stagnation tolerated, bureaucracy replaces skill, expertise becomes political. Eventually, no one knows how things actually work, only how to talk about them. Infrastructure persists until the last competent maintainer retires or dies. Then it quietly fails. 3. Ritual decay. Rituals are compressed meaning. When they decay, holidays become hollow, civic ceremonies feel fake, shared narratives fragment, symbols provoke cynicism instead of reverence. People still perform the rituals, but without belief. At that point, the culture is living on inertia. 4. Why collapse feels invisible while it's happening. The normalcy trap. Humans adapt rapidly to slow decline. Each generation inherits a slightly worse version of reality and assumes, open quote, this is just how things are. Close quote. Decline becomes normalized. What would have been intolerable 50 years ago is now baseline. Collapse happens between headlines. There is no single collapse moment. Instead, services degrade, prices rise faster than wages, quality declines while cost increases, bureaucracy expands to manage its own failures. Each individual change feels survivable. Collectively, they are fatal. Memory loss is a feature, not a bug. Civilizations forget their own operating principles. People remember symbols, not systems. By the time collapse is obvious, the knowledge required to fix it is gone. Shamra 5. Why people misjudge timelines. We expect linear change. People assume decline works like a countdown. In reality, collapse is slow, uneven, reversible, until it isn't. This creates constant false hope, open quote, it got worse but now it's stabilizing. Close quote. What's stabilizing is decay, not recovery. The plateau illusion. Civilizations often enter long plateaus of stagnation. This fools observers into thinking the system survived, the crisis passed. In reality, the system has merely found a lower energy equilibrium. It's alive but weaker. Collapse is personal before it's public. Most people experience collapse privately. Career ceilings, lower expectations, diminished futures, shrinking options. By the time collapse becomes collective, it's already locked in. Number 6. What survives collapse and why collapse does not erase everything? It filters. What tends to survive? Families and kinship networks, practical skills, local traditions, religious or philosophical frameworks, communities with shared norms. These systems operate at human scale. They don't require vast institutions to function. What tends to die? Over-centralized bureaucracies, abstract ideologies, fragile supply chains, symbolic authority, systems dependent on high trust without reinforcement. Collapse rewards redundancy, simplicity, and adaptability. Collapse is compression. What emerges after collapse is not new, it's condensed. Civilization sheds complexity until what remains can be maintained by ordinary humans. This is why post-collapse societies often resemble earlier historical periods, not because they are primitive, but because those structures are resilient. 7. The hidden reframe, retention driver. Each section challenges a deeply held misconception. Collapse is sudden, it's gradual. Collapse is obvious, it's invisible. Collapse is catastrophic, it's mundane. Collapse destroys everything. It selects. Collapse ends history. It resets the scale. The viewer isn't just learning history, they're unlearning myths. That cognitive reframing is what keeps attention locked. Final synthesis. Civilizations don't die screaming. They fade, forget, hollow out, and continue going through the motions long after their spirit has left. By the time the collapse is acknowledged, the decisive losses have already occurred, not in buildings or borders, but in competence, trust, and meaning. The question is never, open quote, will collapse happen? Close quote. The real question is, open quote, what will still work when the rest no longer does? Close quote. That question, quiet, uncomfortable, and deeply personal, is where a new renaissance actually begins. When the systems no longer answer, the question changes. Not how do we fix this, not who is to blame, but something quieter, something that doesn't trend, something you don't ask out loud at dinner. What still works when the rest no longer does? And beneath that, more unsettling still, when the world stops holding you up, what are you standing on? This is where the new renaissance actually begins. Not in institutions, not in manifestos, not in platforms or movements. It begins in personal life, after the abstractions collapse. The moment the illusion breaks. At first, nothing looks different. The lights still come on, the apps still load, the calendar still fills. But something subtle has shifted. You notice that. Official answers no longer match lived reality. Expertise sounds rehearsed, not grounded. Systems respond slower, colder, more mechanically. No one seems responsible anymore. There is a growing sense that you are being managed, not served. That's when the unconscious recalculation begins. You stop asking, open quote, what should I be doing? Close quote. And start asking, open quote, what actually works? Close quote. What still works? The human scale world. 1. Skills you can perform with your own body. When institutions falter, embodied competence becomes priceless. Not credentials, not resumes, not certifications, but knowing how to fix, grow, cook, build, repair, understanding cause and effect, being able to make something real from nothing. You feel the shift the first time you solve a problem without asking permission. It's not dramatic, it's deeply grounding. Your hands remember what the system forgot, and something ancient wakes up in your nervous system. Open quote, I am not helpless, close quote. Hair 2, people who know you without a profile. As trust thins at the institutional level, it condenses locally. What survives are thick relationships, neighbors who trade favors instead of money, friends who show up without scheduling apps, family ties reforged not by nostalgia, but necessity. Social life gets smaller, but denser. You stop maintaining dozens of weak connections and invest in a few that actually hold weight. These relationships are not optimized. They're not aesthetic. They're not frictionless. They're real, and they hold. Hash 3. rituals that still mean something. When mass culture becomes hollow, personal ritual returns. Not corporate holidays, not branded celebrations, but shared meals cooked the same way every week, morning routines that anchor your nervous system, seasonal rhythms tied to light, weather, and land. Simple acts repeated with intention. Ritual becomes less about belief and more about orientation. It tells your body, open quote, this is where I am. This is who I am. This is what matters. Close quote. In a world losing coherence, that orientation is priceless. A day in a withered world, that still works. Imagine waking up earlier, not because you're productive, but because daylight matters again. Your space is modest, functional, quiet. You don't check headlines first, you check the sky. You know what today requires because your life is legible, not infinite, not abstract, bounded. Work isn't glamorous, but it's real. It produces something tangible: food, repair, care, instruction. You feel tired in your body in a clean way, not the exhausted numbness of bureaucratic labor, the earned fatigue of effort. Conversation is slower, more deliberate. People listen because attention is no longer cheap. There's less entertainment, but more presence. Less novelty, but more depth. At night, silence returns. Not the anxious silence of isolation, but the full silence of completion. You sleep knowing, open quote, I mattered today in a way no algorithm can measure, close quote. The emotional shift no one talks about. This life is not easier. It is heavier. You carry more responsibility. You can't outsource everything. There's no illusion of safety net. But something unexpected happens. Anxiety decreases. Not because things are safe, but because they are knowable. The fear of collapse is replaced by a sober clarity. Open quote, I can meet what's in front of me. Close quote, meaning returns, not as happiness, but as gravity. Where the new renaissance actually begins. Not in rebuilding empires, not in restoring the old world, not in escaping collapse. It begins when people quietly withdraw their souls from systems that no longer deserve them and reinvest them in craft, community, and coherence. The new renaissance does not announce itself. It looks like people learning things that don't scale, communities forming without permission, knowledge passed hand to hand, values lived rather than declared. It is not loud. It is not viral. It is not digital first. It is durable. The final, personal question. So the question lingers, quiet, uncomfortable, deeply personal. When the systems thin out, when the guarantees dissolve, when the abstractions stop working, what in your life still functions without them? Because whatever that is, that's where the future is already taking root.